the fight over state funding of New Hampshire Public Television, the results of our New Hampshire Watchdog poll on collective bargaining, and the New Hampshire House rejects amnesty for illegal parrots, coming up in the Cloakroom. Hi, and welcome to the Cloakroom, a weekly look behind the scenes at the New Hampshire State House. I'm your host, Grant Bossing. This week, we'll look at a bill to take away taxpayer support for New Hampshire Public Television, and hear testimony from the sponsor and from his opponents. We'll find out if you agree with the Senate Finance Committee's decision to strip a controversial collective bargaining provision out of the state budget. But first, we tackle the complicated issue of illegal immigration. Sort of. Currently, it's illegal to own or sell several species of exotic birds. Pet owners and pet stores say that one species, the monk parakeet, poses no threat to New Hampshire wildlife and should be legalized. Representative Jenna Roberts stood alone on the House Fish and Game Committee in pushing to get these controversial exotic birds back on the right side of the law. We're joined now in the Cloakroom by Representative Jenna Roberts from Durham. She's a freshman Democrat. Her district also covers Lee and Madbury. Representative, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what is a monk parakeet, and why does the state of New Hampshire care if I own one?
A monk parakeet is a small exotic bird, also known as a Quaker parrot, and the bird used to be imported from Argentina. That was banned in 1992, and the reason that New Hampshire cares is because some people consider it a threat to the New Hampshire environment.
Fish and Game in New Hampshire allowed to define it as an invasive species.
They have qualified it as an invasive species, though the argument I have made is that by the actual definition of invasive species, this bird does not actually qualify as an invasive species.
Now, obviously the threat of exotic pets is they get loose, there's no natural predators, and they run amok. So is this thing going around eating all the native raccoons or something?
So I think what's really important to know about this bird is that we do not have a wild population of Quaker parrots or monk parakeets in this state. In fact, the few states that do have some of these wild populations, most of them do not have a ban on this bird either. They do allow the sale and they do allow the possession of this bird. In some states like Florida, they have a wild population that is established and fairly large, and the biggest impact that anyone notes is that it might be, and in some cases is, a nuisance to electrical lines. So we don't have a wild population. It is unlikely we would ever have a wild population, and even if we did, the worst case scenario would be that they would be a nuisance to home bird feeders and electrical lines.
Kind of like crows.
Kind of like crows, starlings, pigeons, sparrows, those kinds of birds.
And this is a tropical bird, so if it gets loose, pet owner lets it loose, it's probably not going to survive long anyway, at least not through the winter.
Right. I think what's interesting about this bird to note is that in the places that the population has established itself, and even in a cold population, a cold environment like Chicago, the birds that escaped were the birds that were being imported. And the differentiation there is that the birds that could possibly escape here are the domesticated birds that we now have, which are hand-raised, hand-fed, very unlikely to be able to care for themselves because they're currently cared exclusively by owners, which means that the birds we have here in New Hampshire are domesticated pets. They're not wild populations from Argentina.
Okay, so if it gets loose, it's more likely to be a nice meal for a fisher cat than a threat to power lines. The Fish and Game Committee heard a bill that would have legalized monk parakeets or Quaker parrots. You're on the Fish and Game Committee, and you were the lone voice for this bill as it was introduced.
Correct. I was the lone voice. When it was originally sent to us, I wasn't sure how I was going to vote on it. It seemed like maybe this was a reasonable point of negotiation. There was an amendment that was introduced that said you could keep the birds that you already have, but that you could not sell them or buy birds in the future. And so that seemed like an okay compromise until I actually did my homework and realized this is unnecessary legislation. There's absolutely no reason to ban this bird from being sold in this state for pretty much any reason. And when pet shop owners are telling me that this $200 bird that they sell that sells very well, they're no longer going to be able to sell it, that was of huge concern for me.
And pet shops and pet owners didn't know this bird was illegal.
Correct. It's an interesting thing. It's in the rule book. It's not actually in legislation that this bird is banned. It's in the Fish and Game rules, and most people did not know that this bird was illegal. And the inspectors that would come to inspect the pet shops to make sure that they were compliant with the laws also did not seem to know, because no one was ever told they couldn't sell them. So that was very bizarre. And it seemed like maybe it was a rule that was kind of, don't ask, don't tell. It wasn't really considered a high priority, but now for whatever reason it's a high priority. And one person in Nashua had a knock on our door from Fish and Game, and that's how this came forward, this bill to allow monk parakeets in New Hampshire.
To get them out of the underground parakeet economy. So, but what the House did was grandfather in. If you currently have one, it's okay to keep it. You just we can't bring in new ones, and you can't sell it to somebody else.
So that was the amendment. So the amendment came to Fish and Game, and it was voted, 12 people voted to support that amendment, and I voted against the amendment because I thought that the bill as presented, which would allow monk parakeets to continue to be sold and purchased and possessed, was reasonable. And so therefore, I joined up with some of the people that presented the bill, the original bill, and we brought it to the floor, and we were able to overturn the 12-to-1 vote.
Okay, the 12-to-1 vote would have been, well, it would have been amnesty. We would have been, I mean, that's an insult to all the exotic birds who came here legally. But no, we would have been providing a grandfather clause for any monk parakeets currently.
For existing.
Yeah, and
Yes.
where does the bill go now?
So at this point, we were able to pass the bill in its original form, which said that citizens of New Hampshire can sell and buy a monk parakeet. And at this point, the bill goes to the Senate.
All right, expanding freedom one parrot at a time. Representative, this is your first term in the legislature, obviously a fairly unprecedented term in a lot of ways. What are your impressions about the first 3 months here?
It's a very exciting and overwhelming experience. I have really enjoyed it, and I really like being on the Fish and Game Committee. It's by and large a very cordial and there's lots of cooperation on that committee. So I've gotten to know lots of wonderful Republicans and Democrats that I actually find a lot of common ground. Unfortunately, with the legislation, I don't think that there's necessarily a lot of common ground between the two parties. So that's been unfortunate, that for me as a very pragmatic Democrat who prides herself on transparency and fiscal responsibility, that's what I ran on. I don't really feel like I have a lot of opportunity right now.
All right, Representative Jenna Roberts from Durham, thanks for joining us in the Cloakroom.
Thanks for having me.
This week, the Senate Finance Committee recommended killing HB 113, a bill that would prohibit state general funds from supporting New Hampshire Public Television. Taxpayers currently provide over $2.5 million a year to Channel 11, and Representative Steve Valancourt wants that to stop. In addition to zeroing out NHPTV's funding as part of the 2-year budget, Valancourt would prohibit the university system of New Hampshire from using state money on public television. The Senate Finance Committee heard from Valancourt as well as New Hampshire Public Television's CEO Peter Fridd and former State Senator Katie Wheeler during its public hearing on HB 113.
I bring this bill forward because, as we've heard before, we really need to focus on priorities, on needs versus wants this year. We've been through some agonizing discussions about cutting funding for the developmentally disabled, for the elderly, for child care support, for any number of things, legal aid in the House. To me, this is the lowest item on the priority list we could have. And I don't speak because I have anything against Channel 11. I probably watch it more than your average rep. Just like I probably use libraries and museums just more than your average rep. But there's a time when we have to put the needs, as we heard somebody say in the House hearing on the budget, of people ahead of things. Culture is wonderful, but we need to prioritize.
PTV board and I acknowledge and fully understand the severe financial crisis this state faces. However, the impact of this bill goes far beyond the threat of killing Big Bird or darkening NHPTV's screens for people who wish to tune in. The enactment of this bill would indeed have far more serious consequences. New Hampshire Public Television, its board of directors, and the university system of New Hampshire are strongly opposed to this bill for 2 reasons. First, HB 113 singles out NHPTV from the normal budget appropriations process. It immediately removes all of our state funding, which is 1/3 of our budget. This is an unreasonable and punitive action. We have been part of the USNH for over 50 years, and the decisions about our funding should continue to be made by the USNH Board of Trustees. The second we are opposed to HB 113 is purely business. This bill essentially prohibits NHPTV from partnering with state agencies, which as we currently do. It would prevent us from engaging in contracts with other state agencies in support of education, programming, business, infrastructure support, and public safety services.
Anything Channel 11 does, be it science, animal shows, cooking shows, there are 2 or 3 cooking channels, anything that they do, you can get on your own without taxpayer money. I'm also concerned about the limited number of local programming hours that they do. I believe they do 25 weeks or so of the quiz show, which I love. Occasionally they will do a wild show, and I believe they also have one other show that's sometimes on Friday nights reviewing the State House. But of course that's duplicative of what Channel 9 does. I have nothing against them doing it. I have nothing against anything they do, but they should be doing it with non-taxpayer money when we need to fund other things.
A lot of the details about what this bill would do, about things that public television does that aren't immediately obvious to the viewer from Mr. Frid, and I'm talking more about what the viewers see. The annual auction is an incredible community event that is supported by nearly 1,000 volunteers, many of whom take vacation time to participate in this station fundraiser. In fact, I'm continually amazed and gratified by the wide reach of the auction. Just in the past week, this was really quite amazing, 3 people in 3 different cities, a museum visitor, a caterer, and an anesthesiologist, recognized me and told me how much they love NHPTV and the auction. Businesses benefit from the auction as well. Last year, more than 1,900 businesses from around the state made donations to the auction. In return, they received on-air recognition for their products and services. And I know I'm not the only one that when I see a business advertised who's contributing to the auction, I support that business. And I find out about tourist attractions in New Hampshire, like all the wonderful scenic railroad rides we have, Storyland, wonderful features of New Hampshire are showcased on the auction. People buy those and see more about our state.
First page is the salaries of all the Channel 11 personnel. I believe they are way overpaid for what they do. They are way overstaffed. You can see the lead person makes much more, almost 50% more than the governor of the state of New Hampshire. So look at that for your studying of this bill when you're talking about ways they could cut back. The color-coded pie charts are directly from their handout, their expenses in 2010 and their revenues in 2010. You will see that the state of New Hampshire contributes about 31% of their funding for this year, about $2.7 million. So people who say that Channel 11, there'll be no Big Bird or Sesame Street or Juan Can Cook or whoever they're cooking with now, will go away, just not true. They will have to tighten their budget. They'll have to go to other sources. I'm glad Senator Wheeler is here to help them do that. They simply would not get state funds anymore.
The bill heads to the full Senate with the Finance Committee's recommendation against it. The Senate Finance Committee also voted this week to pull the single most controversial provision in the House budget bill. The Kirk Amendment would prohibit unions from including evergreen clauses in any future contracts with the state or cities and towns. If public labor contracts were to expire, public employees would serve at will until a new contract could be negotiated. Unions howl that the Kirk Amendment would effectively kill collective bargaining in New Hampshire. Supporters say it levels the playing field by forcing unions to come back to the bargaining table to get a new deal. We asked you what you thought of the Kirk Amendment in our New Hampshire Watchdog poll, and here are the results. So it appears by a narrow margin you agree with the Senate Finance Committee and do not want to see the Kirk Amendment as part of the New Hampshire budget. This week's poll, in honor of Tax Day, do you think taxes in the United States are currently too low, too high, or just about right? Vote at newhampshirewatchdog.org and we'll bring you the results next week. Until then, I'm Grant Bossy.